All right, welcome back. In case you're just joining us, it's time for our conversation right now. Omotola Abimbola, a senior associate investment research, Chapel Hill Denham, is joining me right now via Skype. Hello, Omotola.
Good morning, Nancy, and thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you very much, Omotola. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
All right, let's get started. Nigeria has entered into a recession. Many Nigerians will say they don't even see a difference, that we've been living in a recession all this while. For economic and financial analysts, recession is part of the normal business cycle. I'll speak to Nigerians about what this recession means.
Looking at the GDP print that came out over the weekend, I think it's more or less confirmed that the economy is in a recession, and the second one in the last 5 years, and probably the deepest recession that we've had since the one that we had in the early 1980s. But for some of us, that came as no surprise, because I mean, don't forget, in our last conversation, I already told you that, recession is a fait accompli. It's unavoidable given the severity of the crisis that we are facing and, the extent that the government has gone to actually, reduce the COVID-19 infection curve, which led to the restriction of movement that we saw at the peak of the pandemic in Q2 2020. But that has further been exacerbated, by other measures taken, such as the OPEC plus production cuts, that took place, that started around May, and that Nigeria had to take additional cuts for in Q3 2020 in order to comply fully with the production cuts. So the resultant impact was that, very large 3.6%, year-on-year GDP decline that we witnessed. But again, there are green shoots, when you look at the data, in depth, and the glass can be said to be half full, because the actual GDP print was actually, I would say, better than what the market expected. For us, before the data was published, we were tracking the data as between minus 3.5% to minus 4.5%. So the actual print was more or less towards the lower end, of our forecast. Also, the market was expecting something, around minus 5.4%. So the actual print was actually better than expected. And that was due mainly to the recovery, that we saw, in areas such as construction, the manufacturing sector, and even, partly also in trade. But speaking as to how this would impact, the consumers, and in fact, the general, economy, in the real sense of things, I would say that Nigeria actually never fully recovered from the last recession, because if you look at the income data, you would notice that, real income has been on the decline over the past 5 years. Unemployment rate has been on the ascent. GDP growth has remained stubbornly stuck between the range of around 1.8 to 2.7%, and far below the pre-crisis level of around 6.7% trend level. So we've never really recovered from that recession, and then here we are again in yet another recession. So it's a very difficult position for any economy to be in. This will definitely impact on the welfare of citizens, including the real income of consumers, including, also the unemployment numbers, which would come out, much more later for the Q3 2020 numbers. Also, I mean, you would naturally, expect to see, job losses during a period of recession. But looking ahead, I think we can also be slightly very optimistic that, once base effects, sets in 2021, particularly Q2 2021, the economy should be able to return back to growth.
Omotola, let's try and unpack these data that we're seeing, just like I analyzed earlier for our viewers, and I hope we can bring in that slide again, that understanding Nigeria's recession, looking at those numbers critically. All production hitting a 4-year low. So far, we're producing about 1.4 million, or about 1.6 million barrels per day of oil from about 1.8 million barrels per day. Don't forget that for the 2020 budget, the projection was more than this, and also for the 2021 budget, it has been projected that we should produce more volume than what we're getting right now. The transport sector was hit, insurance sector also contracted. Unpack for me this data really and what it really means, especially for those in that sector.
Sorry, could you highlight the question once again? I didn't hear that.
Okay, I'm asking that the data that we got from the NBS about 24 hours ago or so about the recession, talking about oil production data, we're producing less oil right now than we should be producing. Transport sector is weak. The construction sector is also weak. We also seen the trade sector weak. Don't forget that our borders are still closed. So what does it mean, especially for people that are involved in these sectors?
So I would say that the biggest drags to growth, as you highlighted, they were mainly the services sector, which was probably hit very hard by the pandemic, and also the restrictions that we had during the period, as well as the oil and gas sector. And I will speak on these two sectors separately. For the oil and gas sector, we saw a very sharp decline in oil and gas in Nigeria's oil production. By roughly 16% year on year to 1.69 million barrels per day, down from the trend level of around 2 million barrels per day that we had in the previous year. And that was as a result, of the oil production port agreement, by the OPEC Plus cartel, which was taken in order to protect, or rather to prevent, a further decline in oil prices. So that had, a very, very big impact on the oil and gas GDP, and resultantly, on the broader economy. For the services sector, it was also very disappointing. We saw a slight pickup in the sector, given that we saw, more than minus 6% year-on-year contraction in the previous quarter. This time around, it's improved only slightly to minus 5.3% or thereabouts. And the underwhelming performance of the services sector could still be attributable to some of the restrictions that were in place, during the period. If we look back to events over the past couple of months, we know that, at the beginning of May, the federal government lifted a 35-day lockdown, that was imposed, on Lagos, Ogun State, and the FCT in Abuja. But then we also had some other restrictions that were in place. We had an existing, curfew. International travels never resumed until around September. Schools were only partially opened. Restaurants and bars were eventually opened in Q3, but they did not open early enough. So all these, more or less affected, the services sector during the period. But we also saw some bright spots. I would say particularly within the industrial sector, and speaking more specifically towards the manufacturing sector, where we saw the contraction in GDP for the manufacturing sector, easing substantially to about, minus 1.5% year on year from, more than 6% that we had in the previous quarter. And that was mainly due to, resumption of construction activities, which reflected positively on the cement sector, which picked up, year on year. We also saw an improvement in the food, beverages and tobacco sector, partly, maybe because, we saw, a very, very extensive, fiscal stimulus and also monetary policy stimulus. And we also saw, the private sector, also working hand in hand with the federal government and the public sector in general to offer some palliatives for consumers. So that helped to lift the performance, of the consumer goods company. And I mean, if we just, cast our mind back to the Q3 earnings releases that we have seen, over the past 2 months, you would notice that, one of the very bright spots for the earnings releases, was in the FMCG category, and also the cement industry as well, which were lifted by the factors I earlier mentioned. So similarly, we saw, a very strong pickup in construction, which returned to growth in the period, as we saw relaxation of some of the COVID-19 restrictions. So in the industrial sector, I would say that it was a bright spot in the GDP data, where we saw, a very, very underwhelming performance, in oil and gas due to the OPEC plus production cost agreement and also the services sector. And then lastly, for the agricultural sector, I would say that was another, underwhelming sector, because we saw a slowdown in growth in that sector to about 1.4%, down nearly 20 bps from 1.6% in the previous quarter. So I think, we've been talking about this for the past couple of months, that Nigeria's agricultural value chain, faced significant pressure during the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw a restriction on movement, which affected migration of labor, particularly in the northern parts of the country, and in turn, that underwhelming, planting season led to an underwhelming harvest season. When harvest, began in the tail end of the Q3, of Q3 2020. Also, we also have, a number of challenges facing the agricultural sector, ranging from logistics, to even the security challenges, affecting farmers, all over the country, but mainly, in the agrarian belt of the north central, to northwest region. So, that goes to show that, beyond the cyclical, impacts of COVID-19, we also have some structural undertones, which weigh on the GDP numbers. And I would say, we can actually tell this looking at the agricultural GDP, which underperformed projection.
Okay, Omotola, let me just halt you a bit, and let's speak about the structural defects which you've mentioned. If you take a look at it, of course, Nigerian economy entered a recession in 2016. We recovered in 2017. We contracted in second quarter of 2020 by about 6%. This GDP contraction now, talking about the recession, because we've seen 6 months now of economic contraction, about 3.6%. From your own analysis, is still less than what analysts had predicted. IMF, I think, predicted about 5%. Even the government predicted, I think, about 8% contraction. So now this is coming below all of that. How much of COVID-19 pandemic, how much of the lockdowns, how much of the border closure, how much of the lack of purchasing power all played out into this recession numbers that we're seeing? And oil price drop.
Yeah. The Nigerian economy, we faced a significant, balance of payments crisis after the 2014, oil price drop. But one thing that was not, even, fully highlighted enough, was that we saw, a significant, we saw significant challenges, facing the consumption aspect of the GDP, looking at the number from the demand perspective. So Nigeria had an economy that boomed, in the early 2000s and even early into the 2010s, mainly because partly because at first we saw some structural reforms that opened up new sectors such as telecom, such as banking, etc. But we shouldn't also understate the important role that the commodity price boom of the 2000s, the role that it played, in the solid GDP numbers that we had then and macroeconomic stability. So then, we had oil prices, sometimes, above $100 per barrel. That helps to fund, cheap foreign exchange, as well as, which translated into, consumption expenditure. But after 2014, when we had that oil price shock and oil prices, essentially, remained stuck, within a range of $70 to $30 per barrel. Nigerian economy, went into what I would say a fundamental structural shift, to a place whereby consumption can no longer support the economy because we could no longer afford, to subsidize, foreign exchange, and also, importation of goods and services. So after undergoing such structural shift, what probably, was needed by authorities then was to undergo, more structural reforms to open up new sectors of the economy, to deepen investment in the economy, particularly in infrastructure, so that we can, so that we can gain export competitiveness that will then, help to rebalance, the trade accounts and the balance of payments, over the medium term. But we haven't seen, enough commitments in these areas, right? And to perhaps even further compound this, we saw, much more, challenges in the security architecture of the country, with the war on terror in the Northeast, gulping billions of dollars, right? And more or less, weighing on fiscal spending. And we also saw, deterioration in the security architecture in the agrarian belt that further affected the agricultural sector. So there are lots of, reforms that have to be embarked on over the medium term. And I will just highlight a couple of these. I would say, first and foremost, we need to see, we need to see, a substantial increase in investment spending in the economy. No doubt the current administration, they have done a very stellar job in this. We have seen, more public sector, funded investments in infrastructure. You can go on and on. We saw, an improvement in the rail, an improvement in investment in rail infrastructure. We saw a couple of, bridges and roads being constructed nationwide. Using debt, using a multilateral, funded or bilateral external debt. We have seen also some private sector, driven investments, in the economy, such as, the NLNG, the new deep sea ports,
Okay,
taking place in
Omotola,
Lekki ETC.
just hold on a bit and let's take a look at, we've talked about how we got here in terms of how we got to the recession. Now we're on the journey, we're on that recessionary road. The question also will be, how do we get out of here? Because if you take a look at it, government has been doing its own bit, at least in the last few months since COVID-19 hit, in terms of the economic sustainability plan of 2.3 trillion naira. The central bank on one end is also coming up with its own interventionist policies and all of that. How do we get out of this recessionary road? Because all those things you're saying, the government is doing it already, but it seems that we still enter the recession. So like I said at the beginning of the program, this administration, I don't know whether to call them unlucky, or is it just because of not too right policies at a particular time? It may be right, but it may not. Some policies may be right, but not at the right time. So how do you categorize all of that?
So, like I mentioned earlier, there are cyclical forces that cannot be fully blamed on the administration. In 2014, we had, a very steep decline in oil prices. We had a major oil price shock. In 2020, we saw another major oil price shock that was caused by COVID-19. So these things are very cyclical. It happens. But beyond that, there are some other structural aspects of growth that, that we could have done better, particularly on security, which has affected agricultural outputs all over the country. Also speaking to, more investments in infrastructure and also additional, ease of doing business reforms. We have seen, movement along all these paths, but I guess, the question is, are they enough to actually offset, the cyclical, shocks, that we have seen, in the economy over the past couple of years? Definitely, they are not enough. And that is why, we're in this situation today. But looking forward, I think I'll be on the optimistic side and say that the current situation will probably be shorter than the last one that we had. I think that by Q2 2021, there's a very strong prospect that the economy will return to growth. And that will be due to what I will call, a low base effect that's going to set in by then. And also because, we are now, we have seen renewed vigor in terms of investment spending in the economy. Very recently, the president approved an infrastructure company that will be jointly sponsored by the NSIA, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, as well as the Central Bank of Nigeria. And that infrastructure fund will be looking to catalyze, investment spending in the economy, by tackling key logistical issues facing the economy. So that's a positive, definitely. I also think that, if you look at the global economy today, we are now entering into a phase, whereby a recovery is more or less, a base case outlook. Partly because we have seen the results of phase 3 vaccine trials by a number of R&D companies in the pharmaceutical sector, and they've all been very, very positive, and it's looking very, very positive that by Q1 2021 we are going to see an effective vaccine. And once we have an effective vaccine, that is going to have a positive knock-on impact on commodity prices, particularly oil prices. We have seen a recovery in oil prices from the low 20s, back above, mid 40s per barrel, and it's looking very, very possible that by next year we are going to see oil prices, average around $50 per barrel. So that's improvement in the oil price outlook, and also the strong possibility that the OPEC plus production cuts will probably be relaxed, sometime in H2 2021. So all these factors I've mentioned, the positive outlook on the vaccine news that will dovetail, into, better commodity prices, and also possible higher oil and gas production in the second half of 2021. The low base effects, that we set in by Q2 2021, and also the renewed vigor, that we are seeing in investment spending by the government. I think all these three factors should probably see the economy return back to growth by Q2 2021. But returning to growth will be the easy task. The much more difficult task will be how to take growth back to pre-2015 level. That is back to the era of 6% plus GDP growth. That will be the difficult task for the government, and I think that should be the main focus of the government.
We have just about 2 minutes to the end of the program. If you say returning to of course, I don't want to say pre-pandemic levels, because pre-pandemic levels numbers were not also too good. You're talking about 2015 growth rate. 2014, I think in 2013, we're posting a GDP growth of about 6%. That, of course, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've not been able to see. The MPC meeting begins today. How many is more than a double whammy right now for the central bank? They are facing inflationary pressures, an elevated one for that matter. They are facing a recession. So this meeting is coming, I think, 48 hours after the NBS released the data. So what should Emefiele and his team be doing, and what kind of meetings should the finance minister be having right now? Not even meetings, what kind of actions? Because we do a lot of meetings. What kind of actions? We do a lot of meetings. It seems that I can't hear Omotola Abimbola anymore. Omotola, can you hear me?
Okay, is it better now?
Okay, yes, I can hear you now. I can hear you now. So please go back quickly to where you started and try to wrap it up in 45 seconds.
Okay, thank you. So I said the MPC, is facing a very, very, they're facing very, very difficult choices. On one hand, we are having macroeconomic instability due to weak FX liquidity and very, very high level of inflation rates. On the other hand, the economy is facing, a very serious challenge with weak GDP growth and high unemployment level. But I think the MPC has clearly communicated in the past that their agenda is going to be pro-growth for now. So I think the outcome of the MPC meeting will probably be, the MPC probably retaining the status quo, but more or less communicating that they're going to remain pro-growth for now until at least we see a recovery, or if see a much more stronger recovery in the economy come 2021. So that's how I look for the MPC meeting.
Okay.
And for fiscal policy, I would say The agenda will still be more fiscal stimulus. We have seen some highlights of the 2020 finance bill, which shows that the government is not looking to raise taxes for now, but would rather be providing reliefs, for households and businesses.
Okay.
And that's continues to be the agenda for the near time.
All right. Thank you very much, Omotola, for joining us today. All right. I've been speaking with Omotola Abimbola, who is a senior associate investment research, Chapel Hill Denham. We've been looking at the recession numbers that came out from the National Bureau of Statistics 48 hours ago. All right, that's the much we can take on today's edition of the program. I am Nancy Naji. Please join us again tomorrow for another edition of Moneyline with Nancy. Be the best you can be. Bye now.